Do you sometimes find it difficult to think about things to say in your IELTS test? Well, this masterclass is just for you. My name is Chris, the IELTS expert, and I scored the perfect band 9 twice in my IELTS exam. Let's begin this masterclass. In this module, I introduce to you the term filler phrase. These filler phrases are extremely useful in your IELTS speaking exam part 2 and part 3 because you need to elaborate more. Elaborate means to talk more about something. Sometimes you need a little bit of time to think, so I'm going to give you some language in today's masterclass that will help you. In part 2 and part 3, you have to speak fluently. It's so important. The examiner wants you to speak as much as possible. So here are some phrases. From memory. When you are giving an experience or a story, you could start your sentence with, from memory, okay, and then talk about more about your experience. Okay, let's practice that. From memory. Another phrase, I remember one time when. If you're telling a story, you could say, I remember one time when. I remember one time when I visited the beach and, okay, and that starts your story. Another phrase, but changing the language, is I recall one occasion when. I recall one occasion when. This is a really useful phrase, so we change the word remember to the word recall. Not recall, but recall. Let's practice that together. Recall. I recall one occasion, or I recall an occasion when. Now this next phrase is extremely useful too because we use a phrasal verb. This phrasal verb is to stand out. To stand out means that I remember it easily. One example that stands out. This one, let's repeat it. One example that stands out. One example that stands out is, and then give your example. Okay? One example that stands out is a time when I visited my grandma. She was in hospital, blah, 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 blah. Okay? Now, a more colloquial or a more spoken phrase is, there was this one time when. There was this one time when I went to. There was this one time when. Let's practice it together. There was this one time when. If you can think of 2 times, you could say a couple of occasions. There were a couple of occasions. There are a couple of occasions which I remember. There were a couple of occasions which I remember. Okay? And that might be when you have 2 or more examples. So you want to tell a story with the examiner. This one is when you don't remember it perfectly. So the word would be vaguely. Can you practice this word here? Vaguely. I vaguely remember a time. I vaguely remember a time when. Okay? And then you can begin your story. In the exam, the examiner might ask you a question about your opinion. Now, many students use the same phrase, I believe, I think, I believe. In the exam, you may want to use the word reckon. Reckon is a spoken form of the word think. I reckon that computers help more, da 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 da. Okay, you would give an opinion. I reckon. This phrase we learned in our module, and it's a filler phrase which is to tell you the truth. And I really want you to push your pronunciation here. To tell you the truth. To tell you the truth. To tell you the truth. To tell you the truth, I reckon that. Okay, so we've combined 2 of my filler phrases there. To tell you the truth, I reckon that mobile phones are helpful to society. And finally, here is another filler phrase which expresses you think there's a problem with something. The problem with blank is, the problem with mobile phones is that people can become addicted. The problem with mobile phones is that people can become addicted. So let's do it nice and fast. The problem with mobile phones, let's do that again. The problem with mobile phones is that people can become addicted. So, in part 2 and part 3, I've said it once and I will say it again. It is incredibly important that you need to speak as much as possible. You need to have lots of good and rich language, but you can't speak slowly because the examiner wants you to speak fluently. So my name is Chris and I'm an IELTS expert. This is IELTS Daily. If you want more sessions, come back and we will be discussing different topics in our future speaking sessions. Thank you so much for watching and good luck. See you soon.